Some moments don't end loudly. They fade quietly. This is one of those moments. I used to believe that nothing changing was a good sign. It meant stability. It meant comfort. It meant we had finally reached that calm place everyone talks about, the one you work toward, the one you're told to protect. For a long time, I measured the health of our life together by what wasn't happening. We weren't fighting. We weren't raising our voices. We weren't threatening to leave. Nothing was broken. Nothing was on fire. Nothing demanded immediate attention. So I assumed everything was fine. What I didn't notice, what I couldn't have named at the time, was how quiet everything had become. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that settles in when something important stops moving. At first, it was subtle. Small enough to dismiss, small enough to rationalize. She stopped telling me about her day in detail, not abruptly, just less thoroughly. The stories shortened. The pauses between sentences grew longer. I'd nod, offer a response I thought was appropriate, and move on. I told myself she was tired, busy, growing into herself. I told myself all the responsible, reasonable things people say when they don't want to look too closely. There were evenings when she would sit beside me, scrolling through her phone, and I'd feel a strange relief that we didn't need to talk. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. I mistook proximity for connection. Looking back, I can see the pattern forming. At the time, it felt like peace. She stopped asking for help with small things, not because she didn't need it, but because she'd learned not to expect it. I didn't notice that shift right away. When someone quietly adjusts their expectations, there's no announcement, no argument, no warning, just a recalibration happening somewhere you're not looking. I still remember the first time she handled something on her own that she normally would have asked me about. I even felt a flicker of pride. She's independent, I thought. She's capable. I didn't ask why she didn't ask me. She started going to bed earlier than I did. Not dramatically, just enough that our nights no longer overlapped the way they used to. I'd stay up, finish whatever I was doing, and eventually slip into bed beside her. She'd already be asleep. I told myself this was normal. Schedules change. People change. What I didn't tell myself was that we'd stopped ending the day together. There's a difference between sharing space and sharing moments. I didn't understand that yet. Weeks passed, maybe months. Time became slippery in that way it does when nothing feels urgent. She smiled less, but not in a way that demanded concern. Just a softer smile, a quieter presence. When I asked if everything was okay, she always said yes, and I believed her. Not because it was true, but because it was easier. Because pressing further would have required me to show up differently, listen more closely, risk discovering something uncomfortable. So I accepted the surface answer and moved on. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when I sensed a distance I couldn't quite define. She'd look at me for a second longer than usual before responding. She'd sigh quietly when I entered the room, then catch herself. She'd start a sentence and stop halfway through, deciding not to finish it. Each time I felt something tug at my awareness. Each time I let it go. I told myself not to overthink. I told myself we were solid. After all, nothing was wrong. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It came in fragments. In the way she stopped making future plans out loud. In the way her laughter sounded like something remembered rather than lived. In the way she no longer argued, no longer tried to be understood. I didn't recognize these signs for what they were. I thought arguments were the danger. I thought conflict meant failure. I didn't know that silence could be a decision. The night everything finally shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no accusation, no sudden confession. We were sitting at the table after dinner, the dishes cleared, the room dimly lit. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally. She folded her hands together and stared at them for a moment before speaking. "I don't think you see me anymore," she said. The words landed softly. No sharp edge, no raised voice, just a statement. I laughed a little instinctively, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. "Of course I see you," I said. "You're right here." She looked up then, really looked at me. That's when I noticed it. The distance wasn't new, it was finished. "I don't mean physically," she said. "I mean, you stopped noticing when I needed you." I wanted to argue, to list examples, to defend myself with facts. But as she spoke, something inside me began to unravel. She talked about the times she'd hinted at being overwhelmed, the moments she'd waited for me to ask more questions, the way she'd learned to stop expecting follow-through. Not angrily, not accusingly, just calmly, like someone explaining something they'd already accepted. "I asked in small ways," she said, "and when nothing changed, I figured that was the answer." That sentence stayed with me. I figured that was the answer. She wasn't angry. That's what frightened me most. She sounded done. "I didn't want to fight," she continued. "I didn't want to beg, so I adjusted." Adjusted. Such a gentle word for something so final. I realized then that all the quiet I'd mistaken for peace had been her letting go. She wasn't pulling away out of spite. She wasn't testing me. She was protecting herself. By the time I noticed, she had already mourned what we were losing. I was just arriving at the conversation she'd been having alone for months. I tried to promise things in that moment. More attention, more effort, more presence. The words sounded thin even to me. She listened politely, then she shook her head. "I needed that before," she said, "not now." That was the moment I understood. You can't arrive late to something that required consistency. You can't make up for absence with urgency. The silence between us after that felt different, heavier. I wanted to rewind, to catch every missed cue, to answer every unasked question. But time doesn't move that way. She didn't leave immediately. There were days of quiet logistics, conversations about practical things, and almost ceremonial calm. But the connection, the thing I thought was safe because it wasn't loud, was already gone. In the weeks that followed, I replayed everything. Every time she'd paused, every time she'd sighed, every time I'd chosen convenience over curiosity. I realized how often I'd treated her presence as guaranteed, how often I assumed love could survive neglect as long as there was no conflict. I learned something uncomfortable. People don't leave when they stop caring. They leave after they've cared alone for too long. By the time I noticed, she had already learned how to be without me, and I was left learning how to see what I'd missed. Sometimes understanding comes too late. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. We'll continue next time.